brought to you by my Patreons.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Fer, and recently I watched an episode of the podcast Within Reason, in which the host, Alex O'Connor, interviews his guest, Philip Goff, and they talk about two theories about consciousness, physicalism and dualism. And as I watched this podcast, I couldn't stop thinking that it really needed the perspective of someone who has a background in physics and someone who has synesthesia. And I happen to be both of those people. So this is my reply to Within Reason episode 27. Okay, so first I think we need a recap on what physicalism and dualism are. And I'll start with physicalism because I think it's the simplest. Physicalism says that the universe can be described with a set of mathematical laws, what we call the laws of nature, and that everything that happens in the universe is a consequence of the interaction between these laws. And then physics and other branches of science come and study these laws, and then, well, we can discover what they are, and then we can use that to predict the behavior of nature. And this includes, of course, the human mind. Like physicalism says that nothing in the universe is outside the laws of nature, and that whatever is happening in our minds can be described with these laws. Although, of course, I think pretty much every scientist in the world will agree that the human brain is just so complex that even if we understand the basic laws of the universe, understanding how they interact to create the human mind is outside what we can do today or what we can do in the foreseeable future. But maybe, who knows, maybe one day humanity will reach the point in which we understand everything that is going on in the human brain. But many people disagree with physicalism. They say that consciousness is not and cannot be the result of the laws of nature. They think that consciousness is a different aspect of reality, separate from the rest of nature. And for this reason, we cannot study consciousness like we study other aspects of nature. And for this reason, this position is known as dualism, because it proposes a dualism between consciousness and the rest of nature. For example, dualists would argue that yes, we can use mathematics to describe everything from the formation of galaxies to how our cells store energy, but we cannot use mathematics to describe our conscious experiences. More specifically, we cannot use mathematics to describe qualia. Let's take the color green as an example. I could give you a complete scientific description of green light. I could tell you its wavelength, its speed, its energy, the equations that describe it, everything. But none of that would tell you how it feels to see green light. Using philosophic terminology, we can call this experience of seeing green light the qualia of the color green. And this is a kind of information that is not accessible through the scientific method. This is not describable with mathematics, and yet it is real. I mean, I can just look at the window right now and see green trees. And the same is true for everything else in our experiences, right? Sounds, emotions, opinions, everything else we feel. All of these things are real, and yet none of them can be described with the same mathematics we use to describe the laws of physics. Alex explains this very well with a chess analogy. Like, imagine there was a group of scientists who wanted to understand chess, and all they have are this list of moves. Like, you know when you finish a game of chess online and you get a list of all the moves that were made during the game? So that's what these scientists have. They just have a list of moves from hundreds and thousands of games. And so looking at these lists of moves, they start studying the game and they begin to deduce what the rules are. And then they are able to describe the pieces based on how they move. They say like, oh, look, a knight is a piece that can move in this L shape. A bishop is a piece that can move diagonally. And at first they think that pawns only move one step forward each turn. But then they study more games and they realize that pawns can move 2 square forwards the first time they move. And then they discover that pawns can capture diagonally. And finally, they discover en passant. And if you don't know what that is, just Google en passant. Doing this, scientists could certainly figure out what the rules of the game are, but they would be no closer to figuring out what the board is actually made of. It could be made of wood, or metal, or plastic, or be entirely virtual. They would have no idea because nothing in the information they have access to says anything about that. And yet, that information is there, and it is accessible through our consciousnesses. And that's what the qualia is. Dualists argue that that's what's happening with science. We are just looking at how the pieces move, and we are figuring out what the rules of the game are, and we are ignoring this whole separate information that is also real. However, dualism has many objections, like the ones presented by Princess Elizabeth of the Palatinate, a philosopher from the 1700s. She argued that if the mind, if consciousness, was really a non-physical entity, then there would be no way for the mind and the body to interact. Because everything that happens to our body is a physical process. When you see something, that is a physical process. That's photons causing a chemical reaction with some molecules in your eyes, and that sends an electrical signal through your nerves that creates a cascade of electrical signals in your brain. And all of those are physical processes. But if the mind is non-physical, then it cannot be affected by any of those physical processes. And by the same reason, the mind shouldn't be able to interfere with any physical process, and then the mind would be unable to control the body, right? Because the body is a physical entity. And so, to try to answer this problem, some people propose that, yes, the mind and the body are different entities, but they can interact not through physical laws, but through psychophysical laws. This position is called naturalistic dualism, and there are people that are studying it very seriously, and they hope to find these laws. One of these people is the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, who has created a version of naturalistic dualism, which he calls the integrated information theory. And he seems to have put a lot of effort into making this not just philosophy, but science. I started reading about it, and this seems like a theory that could be proven or disproven by evidence. For example, he seems to have developed a very robust set of axioms. Although, in my humble opinion as a reluctant amateur philosopher, I don't see much of a difference between naturalistic dualism and just plain old physicalism. Because if these psychophysical laws really exist, and we can test them and discover them and understand them, I don't see how they would be different from any other laws of physics. It would just mean that the physical world had more basic elements that we had originally thought. Now we can actually get to what was discussed in the episode of Within Reason. Here, the guest Philip Goff proposes a theory that attempts to be the Hannah Montana of the problem of consciousness by having the best of both worlds. And I'm just slightly paraphrasing there. He did say something really similar to that. And this theory is really well explained by its name. In Greek, pan means everything, and psyche means mind. So Panpsychism proposes that everything is conscious, that everything has different levels of consciousness, especially fundamental particles. This might sound crazy, so let's back up a bit. Philip Goff says that Galileo made a mistake hundreds of years ago. Galileo thought that everything in the universe could be explained with mathematics, and in doing so, he started the scientific revolution, which allows me to record this video and you to see it. But the mistake of Galileo was not realizing that consciousness cannot be explained with mathematics. And so, while we've been doing all this progress in understanding how the universe works, we have not made much progress in understanding what the universe is. And so, Goff wants to fix Galileo's mistake. And to do that, he takes a page from Descartes' book, and he says that, well, the only thing whose existence we can be certain of is consciousness itself, right? So consciousness must be the fundamental building block of reality. And so, you know how physicalism says that consciousness is the result of the interactions of the laws of physics. And yet, physicalism cannot explain qualia. Philip Goff would say, like, duh, obviously, because consciousness does not arise from the interactions of laws of physics, but rather physics arises from the interactions of qualia. That's why physics cannot explain qualia or consciousness, because it is a deeper, more fundamental layer of reality. But this means that the fundamental particles must be conscious, that protons and quarks and neutrinos, all of this stuff, they must be conscious in some very primitive and limited way. And yet, when they come together to create beings such as us, all of these tiny primitive consciousness sort of resonate together or something to create higher levels of consciousness. Okay, so by this point, I hope to have presented Panpsychism and dualism in general fairly, although obviously there's so much more we could say about them. And now I'm gonna proceed to tell you why I disagree with them entirely. When someone explains dualism to me, it feels like a magic trick. Like when a magician makes a dove appear out of nowhere. It is a very beautiful trick, and I have no idea how it is done, but logically, I know the dove was already there the whole time. It was just hidden somehow in a way I couldn't notice. Similarly, when someone explains why qualia and consciousness have to be real and yet unphysical, it feels like a magician insisting that they really did make the dove appear out of nowhere. This whole thing made me want to learn how the trick is done. Like, how can qualia seemingly appear out of nowhere? And so I started reading some textbooks about neuroscience and watching some lectures about neuroscience in YouTube. And I think neuroscience already has a very good solution to the problem of qualia. But before I explain that, I have to explain the physics of information. In my following argument, I'm gonna mention information a whole lot. And it is very important to me to clarify that information is a physical quantity. Not only that information is real, but that it is something physical. It can be measured like we can measure temperature, or mass, or electric charge, or anything else. And this was discovered by Claude Shannon. He was actually an engineer working for the Bell phone company, and he got curious about how much information was traveling down the phone cables. And while studying this problem, he realized to his own surprise that it could actually be measured. And in fact, if you want to read his original paper, it is surprisingly accessible. It is very well written. I recommend it. And so, yeah, information is something physical. And in fact, Stephen Hawking, the reason he became famous originally was because he was able to calculate how much information black holes could hold in their surface, which was very relevant for other physical stuff I have no time to explain. But yeah, like black holes contain information, and I can tell you exactly how much. Isn't that incredible? And in fact, for this reason, if you gave me 2 hard drives, and one of them was full of movies, books, music, and whatever, and the other was empty, there are measurements I should be able to do with these hard drives without connecting them to a computer or anything, just measuring their physical properties. And I would be able to tell you which one had all the movies and music and stuff, and how much. I could tell you exactly how many gigabytes of information were there. Although I think I would need to destroy the hard drive in the process. I think, in fact, someone actually proved that you cannot measure the information of a system without destroying it. I'm not sure on that. But anyway, the point is that information is a physical quantity. And the reason I make so much emphasis in this is because if someone thinks that consciousness is a non-physical aspect of reality, they could very well think that it is the same for information, right? Because information and consciousness seem to be very related. And I just want to clarify that in the case of information, We know that's not the case. We know information is physical quantity. Now, let's talk about how the brain processes information. And before we do that, I just want to clarify that my degree is in physics, not neuroscience. I mean, I did read and watch some lectures to prepare for this video. But I could still get something wrong. And if there's any neuroscientist in the audience who wants to correct me, please do so. I don't like to be wrong. If you can correct me, I appreciate it. But anyway, so the way that the brain processes information is that it all starts with our sensory organs, right? There are many ways our brains can gain information about the world. And it's all about through these organs, like our eyes, or ears, or skin lets us touch things, we can smell and taste things. And those are the five senses, but we have also more senses than that, right? We have proprioceptions, we can sense acceleration, but anyway, the point is that we have a limited set of senses, a limited way for our brains to get information about the world. And then that information travels through our nerves and makes its way to our brains, where it is processed in different circuits, which I'm gonna call sensory circuits. For example, right now I am seeing my camera, and the information, the light of that camera is arriving into my eyes, and my eyes are sending a signal that travels down my optical nerve to somewhere near the back of my brain, because that's where the optical circuit is located in the brains of humans, and I think most animals in general. And so that's where the visual inputs are processed. And then if I hear something, that's processed somewhere around here. If I feel things, it is processed somewhere, I think, near the middle, stuff like that. So we have different circuits, different regions of the brain that process this information. And these different regions, these different circuits, can work independently from each other. Like, there are many examples of people that sadly get brain damage for one reason or another, perhaps an accident or an illness or something. And while that region of the brain is damaged and they cannot process that information as well anymore, or maybe they cannot process it at all, the other parts of the brain can continue working just fine. And in fact, they can increase their effort, or like they increase their workload in a way to compensate for that. Okay, so we have established that the brain has different sensory circuits that process different sources of sensory information. And what follows is actually the most important part of my argument, so let me read it straight from the script. Once the sensory information is processed, these circuits create new streams of information, which are processed by another set of neural circuits. Let's call them rational circuits. These are the ones in charge of interpreting the world and making decisions based on the information. For example, your sensory circuit dedicated to hearing is processing the words, the sounds I'm making, and it is sending that process information to a rational circuit in charge of language, which, by the way, is somewhere, I think, near the front of the brain. And then that rational circuit decodes the meaning of the words I'm saying. Rational circuits can then produce their own streams of information, like how the rational circuit in charge of language in my brain is sending information to the circuit in charge of my mouth in order to make me say these words. However, it is important to point out that while these different circuits can communicate, they cannot loop back, which is clear in the case of optical illusions, like the famous spinning girl, which I'm gonna put somewhere in here, I guess. Your eyes detect this light and send information to the visual circuits, and then that creates what you are watching right now. But then that information is sent to one of the rational circuits in your brain. Oh, by the way, you have more than one rational circuit and they have different tasks. And then one of these rational circuits recognizes this optical illusion, and it knows this information can be interpreted in two different ways. And by changing how this circuit interprets the information, you will see the spinning girl spinning in different directions. But now, let's say that instead of this optical illusion, you wanted to see something completely different, like the B-movie, but everyone is Shrek somehow. Well, you can imagine that, but the spinning girl will not be replaced by the thing you are imagining. In other words, rational circuits and sensory circuits can communicate. Rational circuits can even request simulations of how something would feel like. But this flow of information between them cannot replace the stream of information coming from your sensory organs. To summarize in one phrase, rational information cannot replace sensory information, because that's just not how the brain is wired. To me, this is the explanation for the magic trick of Qualia. Because if I explain to you every aspect of green light and how our brains react to it, all of that is rational information. It cannot loop back to your visual circuit to become a visual experience. This is why the qualia of seeing the color green cannot be communicated, because of the limitations of our brains, not because consciousness is the fundamental substrate of reality. But I can imagine the objection someone would have to this, that qualia is still real, and we are still unable to express it mathematically like we do with the rest of physics. Okay, well, let's say that in the not too distant future, we develop technology good enough to see everything that happens in the brain when we see the color green. And we are able to describe every step in the process of perceiving the color green. And then let's say that we write an article describing that process. And then if you read it or if someone explains it to you, all of that information would still be rational information. And rational information still cannot loop back to become sensory information because your brain is still not wired like that. So even though that description of how we see the color green contains all the relevant information to the perception of the color green, your brain is just not wired in a way that would allow that information to be perceived like visual information. My point here is that in principle, it would be perfectly possible to describe every experience a human could have in terms of how your neurons are exchanging information. But even if we had those perfect descriptions, they wouldn't evoke in our minds those experiences, because that's just not how the brain works. And this makes a lot of sense, because if the brain wasn't wired like this, then any understanding of a rational concept would be the same as experiencing that concept. Someone could come and explain hell to you, and suddenly you would be experiencing hell. Someone could come and explain heaven to you, and suddenly you would be in heaven. Remembering would be the same thing as living. Someone telling you about their day would be the same thing as you living their day. Like, it would be impossible to distinguish between the real world and your rational thoughts. An organism like that would never survive in nature. So, because think about it, it's not only humans that are rational. Pretty much every animal is capable of making some kind of rational decisions. And so it makes a lot of sense that this structure of the brain developed early in our evolutionary history. Because if the brain was going to be processing information, it needed to never confuse sensory information and rational information. Except that sometimes rational information can become sensory information. And when that happens, we call that a hallucination. Because, yeah, sometimes information can flow in the brain in ways that it's not supposed to. But when that happens, it is usually the symptom of a mental illness or some other kind of condition that needs to be stopped or treated. And when someone, for whatever reason, is vulnerable to having hallucination, it is actually possible to induce hallucinations on them. Like, you could say them a certain string of words and make them hallucinate pretty much anything you want. You could make them even see the color green. So yeah, it is possible to induce the qualia of the color green or pretty much anything else if the brain of the person in question is not working properly. But sometimes the brain can be wired in a way that is non-standard, and yet it's not a problem, as in the case with synesthesia. And synesthesia is the name for a set of different conditions in which perceiving one thing can make you perceive another one. So, for example, someone might hear a certain musical note, and this might cause them to see a certain color. But the color doesn't appear in your vision as a flash of light, but it's not in your imagination either. It feels real. You are actually seeing it somehow. And this is caused by these unusual or non-standard wirings of different circuits in the brain. And I actually have two kinds of synesthesia. One of them is the grapheme color synesthesia, which means that some grapheme, some letters or numbers or stuff like that, can evoke in me the certain colors. For example, the number 4 evokes in me the color of green. And I also have this, it has a very weird name, ordinal linguistic personification, which means that many abstract concepts have personalities to me. It started with numbers, and that's the way it is described in most places, that numbers have personalities. But to me, it's also letters, and the more I learn about science, all of these abstract concepts get personalities. Like, for example, when I solve an integral, it feels like a story. It feels like a story with villains and plot twists and friends and stuff like that. When I was learning differential calculus, every solution, every differential equation felt like a different person with their own personality, and I liked some and I didn't like the others. And when I learned about quantum field theory and I got more into the symmetries of nature, each symmetry, as I came to understand them, also got their personalities. And it's just not, it's not like I decide to assign them those personalities. It's not like I consciously do it. It just sort of happens. It's completely involuntary. And anyway, so those are the kinds of synesthesia I have. And in philosophical terms, we could describe them as the qualia of one thing evoking the qualia of another thing. And so, for example, you can see me perceive the qualia of color green by just reminding me of the number 4. It works 100% of the time. Make me think about the color 4 and the color 4. Maybe I think about the number 4 and I will see the color green very really, very real in my mind. Oh, by the way, all the colors have numbers and all the colors have personalities, but I'm just going to keep using the example of 4 and green, just to be consistent through the rest of the video. And I think that synesthesia is a serious problem for dualism that I haven't seen anyone else bring up in my readings about this topic online. Because let's think about it. Let's say that physicalism is right, qualia is real. Okay, so then you say to me the number 4. 4 is a number. It's fundamentally non-physical. It would have to be a qualia, right? And yet it induces in me this secondary qualia of green. Where did it come from? If qualia is real, where did that qualia come from? Maybe you could argue that it was already in the qualia of 4. Maybe it has always been there, but most people cannot perceive it. Fine, but then I can find people for whom the number 4 also has the qualia of red or yellow, blue, of flavors, of smells, of musical notes, anything. Does that mean that number 4 have all of those qualia already? Because if you are insisting that consciousness is real and that qualia is real, it would have to mean that all of that was already there, right? Going back to the chess metaphor, it would mean that each piece is made of wood and plastic and metal and is virtual, and it's none of that. And that just doesn't make sense. Because if qualia is real, it would have to be consistent. And it's not. What is consistent is the wirings of the brains. Maybe if you scanned my brain, you would be able to see the wiring that makes me perceive the number 4 as the color green. And maybe if you scan the brains of enough people, you would be able to find other people with the same wiring and the same kind of synesthesia. It would be possible. That would be consistent. I'm betting you could do that experiment and find consistency there. But you can find consistency in an explanation that is physical, but you cannot find consistency in an explanation that insists that consciousness is not physical. An explanation that is not consistent, well, just doesn't seem too useful to me. But then we can take all of this back to the most famous thought experiment in the problem of consciousness, Mary's room. So I'm gonna modify it a little to explain it here, but it goes like this. So there's a girl named Mary, and when she was born, she was born in a dark room, no light, and on top of her they placed these goggles, and these goggles completely filter out all of the colors. So as she grew up, she only saw all in black and white. She never saw any other color other than black and white. But then Mary was a super scientist. She is able to learn anything she wants perfectly. She has access to this all perfect information. She can read any book and understand anything. And so Mary learns everything about color perception. She learns everything about how humans perceive colors. But she has never seen colors because she has always had these goggles in front of her eyes. But then one day Mary, I don't know, escapes whatever cruel people are doing this to her. And then she goes to a field, and then there's grass there. So she touches grass. She takes off her goggles. Does she see, and she sees the color of grass for the first time. She sees green for the first time. And the thought experiment asks, is she surprised? Is this a new experience? And obviously, like most people agree that yes, because she had never experienced the quality of green, because I would argue all the rational information that she learned about color perception never became sensory information. Anyway, but now let's switch the experiment. And of course, dualists use this to argue that qualia is non-physical and whatever. But now let's switch the experiment a little bit. And let's say that Mary learned everything about synesthesia, right? Before taking off her goggles. She still has her goggles on, she learns everything about synesthesia, and she realizes that there's a brain surgery she could have that could give her synesthesia. And let's say that some of the cruel people that are doing this to her does that brain surgery on her. Like, she designs it, she tells them how to do it, and they do it. Okay, so now Mary has the surgery, and now she has a brain with the same wiring as a person with synesthesia. Specifically, my thing that when I think about the color 4, the number 4, I see the color green. So after the surgery, she wakes up and someone says to her, 4. And maybe she has this new kind of experience she had never had before, like a color, right? And maybe she doesn't know exactly what it is. But it is there, her brain is wired like that. And so later, when she escapes and she takes off her goggles, when she sees the grass and she sees its color, I think she would be able to recognize it as the same color she was seeing, this new extra qualia she was perceiving when someone told her the number 4. And this does it to me. To me, this proves that qualia and consciousness are physical things that are just the product of how our brains are wired. But now I have to address the elephant in the room of how do all of these different circuits come together to create a single unified perception, a single unified consciousness? And the answer is that I don't know. And I don't think anyone else does. I think we are many decades away to figuring that out. And okay, maybe someone could argue that there's something non-physical there. That yeah, there's something non-physical in how all of these processes come together. But that just seems to me like the consciousness of the gaps. Like in every step of this process that we don't understand, you could argue there's something non-physical there. But the way I see it, if everything that goes in is physical, everything in the middle is physical, then everything that comes out has to be physical as well. It is physical all the way through. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine. But I know that many people don't agree with that. Because when Philip Goff talks about panpsychism, I don't think he says this explicitly, but it seems he was depressed when he was convinced of physicalism. And it seems that Panpsychism was like a liberation to him, that it made him feel better about himself and about his place in the world. And that's the reason he promotes this philosophical idea. And I can understand that because, yeah, there is something very comfortable in thinking that there's some aspect of us that is above nature and it's uncaring mathematical laws. But I don't think that's the case. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. Because here's the thing. Even if the laws of nature are uncaring and cold and whatever, we don't have to be. We can be better than that. You see? Like, it doesn't matter if there's no part of us that is above the laws of nature. Because that doesn't change the fact that all the things we feel are still real. Even if they are just the product of the laws of physics, that doesn't make them any less real. In philosophy, they have this concept of the philosophical zombie. And it's not like the zombies of the video games or the movies. This is a being that acts like a conscious being, but is not conscious. And to me, it makes no sense, because to me, consciousness just is a processing of information. So if this being is processing information in a way that makes it act like a conscious being, then it is a conscious being. But the way philosophers talk about it is like they are like, oh, we don't want to be that. We are not that. We are better than that. But here's the thing. We don't need anything extra to be better than that. All that we need is to be true to what we feel. And that's it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's an illusion, if it's real to us. And that's my point. Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's an illusion, if it's real to us. And that's what we humans have been doing for a long time. I think this is not a revelation. We already knew this. And that could be the end of the video, except, of course, I have more to say about that, specifically about the connection between panpsychism and quantum mechanics. Okay, here it goes. Okay, so let's look at the postulates of panpsychism. Panpsychism says that even fundamental particles have consciousness, like a very primitive form of consciousness, but consciousness nonetheless. And the whole point of consciousness is that it can affect the physical world, right? Like our consciousness moves our body to affect the physical world, right? So if we have this capacity and our consciousness comes from the consciousnesses of these fundamental particles, then these fundamental particles should be able to affect the physical world, although in a much more limited way, right? Okay, so all of those are just the consequences of the postulates of panpsychism. So now let's look at how this primitive consciousness could affect the physical world. Like, for example, with spin. Spin is these properties of particles, can be up and down. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch a video explaining it. But anyway, and we know that when we measure any of these quantities, they are fundamentally probabilistic, right? We never know the spin that we're gonna get. We can only know the probabilities of each measurement, okay? And you could argue that this is because this is proof that the particles have consciousness. They have consciousness, so you don't know what they are going to choose to do, if have or spin up or spin down. Okay, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you could argue that's the case. Fine. But then that means that the particle is taking a decision, right? Taking a decision that we don't know. And then based on that decision that consciousness made, that determines the result of the measurement. Here's the problem. In physics, we would call that decision a hidden variable. And here's the thing. We know that hidden variables are not real. And in fact, the guys who discovered that hidden variables are not real got a Nobel Prize last year. In fact, the people over at PBS Spacetime made a video explaining that. And that video is incredible, amazing, one of the best videos I've ever seen, and I wrote it. Anyway, okay, so we know that hidden variables are not real. So, and we know that for a fact, right? This is an experiment. You can test it. You can do it in your lab. You can convince yourself of this. So if hidden variables are not real, then this primitive consciousness in these particles are not making decisions, right? They can't. They cannot be a hidden variable. And so, what are you left with? Then you're forced to conclude that the consciousness of these particles, if it exists, has to be the wave function. Because, okay, the wave function is this mathematical object that describes the probabilities of each possible measurement, right? And that's all it is. The fact that there are no hidden variables proves that the wave function is all there is describing the behavior of the particle. And if the behavior of the particle is described entirely by the wave function, and the particle has some kind of consciousness that determines its behavior, then its consciousness has to be its wave function, right? Like, I don't believe that's the case. Again, this is not something I believe. I'm just saying that based on my understanding of Panpsychism, it seems that that's the only logical conclusion. And maybe at first it doesn't seem so bad, because the wave function has many of the properties you want to give to consciousness. The wave function is fundamentally unobservable. Okay, that seems a lot like the consciousness you are proposing. That is fundamentally something non-physical. In fact, yeah, the wave function is something non-physical. It cannot be measured. We can only deduce what it is from our observations. It's like, for example, if you see me like with an orange and a pear in my hands, and in the end I put the pear down and I start eating the orange, you can deduce that my conscious state was between choosing one of them, right? And so that's kind of like what we do in physics. We look at the results of the measurements and we deduce the wave function from that, but we can never detect the wave function directly. And that sounds a lot like the consciousness you are proposing. So it's fundamentally non-physical, fundamentally unobservable, fundamentally non-deterministic. That's also a thing you want, right? Like, you want the consciousness to be free from the laws of physics. Well, I think this is as free as the laws of physics as you are gonna get, as something that we can only know the probabilities of each result, but we can never know them for a fact. Yeah, I think that's, yeah. I think it's not possible to be any more detached from the laws of physics than that. And finally, when you have many particles coming together, each particle has its own wave function, but they all together have a big wave function that describes the properties of the entire system. In fact, there should be, in theory, a wave function that describes all the particles in my brain. And if you have that wave function, you would know everything about me, and you could predict everything I'm gonna do, assuming you updated the wave function. Because yeah, the wave function has all the information of all the particles in my brain. So yeah, that seems like the consciousness you say that arises when you have a large number of fundamental particles. So again, I'm not saying I subscribe to those ideas. I'm just saying they are logically consistent with Panpsychism. But the problem with that, the reason I think that most people that like Panpsychism wouldn't like this idea of the wave function is the fact that the wave function is fundamentally a mathematical thing. Even if it's probabilistic, it can still be described with mathematical laws. And it would mean that consciousness is fundamentally something that is described by mathematical laws. And I'm not sure that's what they want. But if they want it, they can have it. I'm giving it for free. You can take it. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about physicalism and dualism and the problem of consciousness. Thanks for watching.
I have to pay $268 in student debt each month, and my Patreons help me a lot with that. And for that reason, I have to give special thanks to Automotiosum, Carlo Facioli, T. Highfield, Valerie Hyde, and my newest Patreon, Alec Luman. All my Patreons, thanks 1,000 times, thanks a million times.